The early morning sun painted streaks of orange across the Denver International Airport as Captain James Morrison walked through the terminal, pulling his airline pilot's bag with practiced ease. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, matching the rhythm of his thoughts as he went through his usual pre-flight routine. 20 years of flying commercial planes had given him an almost sixth sense about his flights, and today, something felt different. The boarding process started normally enough. Business travelers in pressed suits tucked themselves into first class, young families struggled with car seats and diaper bags, and tourists chatted excitedly about their upcoming Vegas adventures. Morrison stood at the cockpit door, greeting passengers with a warm smile, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. That's when he heard them before he saw them. The heavy thud of motorcycle boots and the distinct jingle of chain wallets caught his attention. 5 men in leather vests were making their way down the jet bridge, their presence commanding attention without a single word spoken. The Steel Thunder Motorcycle Club patches on their vests weren't just decorations, they were badges of membership in one of the most notorious biker groups in the western United States. The first biker ducked through the airplane door, his massive frame nearly filling the entire space. A thick beard covered his face, peppered with gray, and his arms were decorated with faded tattoos that told stories of their own. Behind him, his 4 companions followed, each carrying the same intimidating presence. Morrison noticed how other passengers instinctively shrank in their seats as the bikers passed. A young mom pulled her child closer. An elderly couple exchanged worried glances. Even the usually unflappable flight attendants seemed to tense up slightly. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken concern. As the group made their way down the aisle, they weren't exactly causing trouble, not yet. But their loud voices, rough language, and the way they deliberately bumped seats as they passed made their intentions clear. They were marking their territory, showing everyone that they weren't going to play by the usual rules of polite airline behavior. What caught Morrison's attention most wasn't their size or their patches, it was their eyes. He'd seen that look before, the kind of look that said they were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before someone pushed back. They were scanning the cabin, noting the exits, checking out the flight attendants, and sizing up other passengers. It was predatory behavior, plain and simple. The last biker passed Morrison, throwing him a look that might have made a less experienced man step back. Instead, Morrison met his gaze steadily, his face professional but unyielding. 20 years in the cockpit had taught him that the first moments of interaction often set the tone for the entire flight. As Morrison stepped into the cockpit to begin his pre-flight checks, his co-pilot Tom was already flipping switches and reviewing weather reports. "Did you see that group that just boarded?" Tom asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Steel Thunder guys. They've got quite a reputation." Morrison nodded as he settled into his seat, adjusting it with familiar precision. "I saw them," he replied, his voice calm, but his mind already running through various scenarios. He'd dealt with difficult passengers before. Drunk spring breakers, entitled celebrities, panicked first-time flyers. But this was different. These men weren't just difficult passengers, they were a potential powder keg at 30,000 feet. As the final preparations for takeoff continued, Morrison could hear the bikers' loud laughter from the main cabin, punctuated by the occasional worried voice of a flight attendant asking them to take their seats. He caught fragments of their conversations, boasts about their Vegas plans, crude jokes, and what sounded like subtle threats when asked to follow basic flight rules. Morrison took a deep breath as he reached for the intercom to make his welcome announcement. In his gut, he knew this wasn't going to be just another routine flight to Las Vegas. His instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive through countless situations, were telling him to stay alert. As the engines began to spool up and the morning sun cast long shadows across the runway, Captain Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that his experience, training, and judgment were about to be put to the test in ways he hadn't expected when he put on his uniform that morning. The plane pushed back from the gate, and as they taxied toward the runway, Morrison heard the distinct sound of someone ignoring the seatbelt sign, followed by a flight attendant's polite but firm request for compliance. It was beginning already. The real question wasn't if there would be trouble, it was when, and how he would handle it when it came. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when the first signs of real trouble began. The soft ding of the seatbelt sign turning off seemed to serve as a starting gun for the bikers, who immediately began testing boundaries. Their initial movements through the cabin might have looked casual to an untrained eye, but Captain Morrison, monitoring the situation through updates from his crew, recognized it as something more calculated. Lisa, the lead flight attendant with 15 years of experience, knocked on the cockpit door. Her usually cheerful face was tight with concern as she stepped inside. "Captain, we might have a situation developing," she said, keeping her voice low. "The Groot from Steel Thunder is becoming increasingly disruptive." Through her measured words, Morrison could tell she was downplaying the severity. Flight attendants were trained to handle difficult passengers, and Lisa wasn't one to raise concerns without good reason. She described how the bikers had spread out through the cabin, taking up strategic positions, one near the front lavatory, two in the middle section, and two towards the rear. "They're playing some sort of game," Lisa continued, her professional demeanor masking her unease. "Every time we ask them to follow basic protocols, they find new ways to push back. They're timing their bathroom trips to when we're doing beverage service, deliberately blocking the aisle." The big guy with the gray-streaked beard, who the others called Bear, had become particularly problematic. When asked to return to his seat during a patch of turbulence, he'd stood his ground, spreading his feet wider instead of moving. "Make me," he'd said, not exactly a threat, but the intention was clear in his tone. Out in the cabin, the tension was spreading like a virus. A businessman trying to work on his laptop closed it after one of the bikers kept accidentally bumping his seat. An elderly couple who had been quietly reading now sat rigid, their books forgotten in their laps. A young mother near the back had asked to be moved away from the two bikers who kept making increasingly crude comments. The situation reached a new level when Bear made his way to the front of the plane during another bout of turbulence. The seatbelt sign was clearly illuminated, and the plane was bouncing enough that even seasoned travelers were gripping their armrests. But Bear moved through the cabin like he owned it, deliberately brushing against seats and ignoring requests to return to his place. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately," Lisa had said firmly, standing her ground in the narrow aisle. Bear towered over her, his leather vest creaking as he crossed his arms. "Just stretching my legs, sweetheart," he'd replied, his voice carrying through the cabin. "Maybe you should focus on bringing me another drink instead of telling me what to do." The other flight attendants were dealing with similar challenges. One of the bikers in the back had started a loud conversation about his time in prison, making sure his voice carried to the families seated nearby. Another was conducting what appeared to be some kind of business deal with a nervous-looking passenger, ignoring repeated requests to return to his seat. Through it all, the bikers maintained a facade of plausible deniability. They weren't openly aggressive, they were too smart for that. Instead, they created an atmosphere of underlying menace, a subtle but persistent reminder that they could escalate the situation at any moment. Morrison listened to Lisa's report while maintaining his outward calm, but his mind was already cycling through options. He'd dealt with unruly passengers before, but this was different. These men were organized, coordinated in their disruption. The way they positioned themselves throughout the plane, their timing, their careful balance of intimidation and technical compliance, it all pointed to something more calculated than simple bad behavior. The interphone buzzed again. This time it was Mike, another flight attendant, his voice tight with controlled stress. "Captain, I think you should know. I'd overheard two of them talking about taking control when they thought I wasn't listening. Could be nothing, but..." Morrison knew it wasn't nothing. In the post-9/11 world, certain phrases triggered immediate responses. But he also knew that rushing into action could escalate the situation unnecessarily. They still had over an hour of flight time remaining, and at 30,000 feet, options were limited. Through the cockpit door, he could hear Bear's voice rising again, this time in what sounded like an argument with another passenger who had objected to his behavior. The other bikers were growing louder too, their voices carrying a note of anticipation, like they were waiting for something. As Morrison processed all this information, he noticed his co-pilot, Tom, glancing at him with increasing frequency. They both knew that standard protocol for disruptive passengers involved diversion to the nearest airport. But Morrison's instincts, honed by years of experience both in and out of the cockpit, told him there might be a better way to handle this situation. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and through the cockpit door came the sound of something crashing, followed by raised voices. Morrison knew he had to act soon. These men were testing more than just the airline's rules. They were testing his authority as captain, and how he responded in the next few minutes would determine whether this flight landed safely or spiraled into a more dangerous situation. As Captain Morrison monitored the growing chaos in his aircraft, his mind flashed back to another time, another crisis, worlds away from commercial aviation. The memories came not in a flood, but in sharp, clear fragments, like pieces of a puzzle that had shaped him into the pilot he was today. 25 years earlier, he'd been a young Marine, fresh out of flight school, eager to prove himself. His commanding officer had taken one look at him and said, "Kid, being a good pilot isn't about how well you fly when everything's going right. It's about what you do when everything goes wrong." Those words have stuck with him through every challenge that followed. The next 15 years had transformed him. Force Recon wasn't just a line on his service record, it was a crucible that had forged his character. He remembered the night missions, flying low over hostile territory, the lives of his fellow Marines depending on his judgment. One particular mission stood out, an extraction gone wrong in a remote mountain range. 3 helicopters down, radio silence mandatory, and 16 lives hanging in the balance. He'd kept his cool then, just as he needed to now. The skills that had kept his team alive during those years weren't just about flying, they were about reading people, understanding situations, and knowing exactly when and how to act. His co-pilot, Tom, noticed him checking the flight instruments with the same measured calmness he always showed. "Everything okay?" Tom asked, picking up on his captain's deep concentration. Morrison nodded, but his mind was already piecing together a strategy. The techniques he'd learned in the Marines weren't just about combat. They were about control, about understanding human nature. He remembered his training officer's words. "The best weapon you have isn't in your holster, it's between your ears." During his military years, he dealt with situations far more intense than unruly bikers. There was the time he'd landed a damaged aircraft in a sandstorm, keeping his entire crew calm through the ordeal. Or the hostage negotiation training he'd received, learning how to defuse volatile situations without firing a shot. Those experiences had taught him that true strength often lay in restraint and strategic thinking rather than brute force. His time with Force Recon had also taught him to read people, really read them. The way the biker gang was operating reminded him of insurgent tactics he'd studied: probe the defenses, test the boundaries, look for weaknesses. But he'd learned to see past the surface, to understand what drove people to act the way they did. The memories of his military service weren't just about combat and crisis. They were about the people he'd served with, the bonds formed in those intense situations. He remembered the quiet conversations in remote bases, learning about human nature from men and women who came from every walk of life. Those lessons were proving just as valuable at 30,000 feet as they had been in the field. Morrison's thoughts turned to his transition from military to civilian life. It hadn't been easy, trading combat missions for commercial flights, switching from military protocols to airline procedures. But he brought something valuable with him: an understanding of how to maintain control without escalating a situation. He thought about his first year as a commercial pilot when a passenger had suffered a severe panic attack mid-flight. Instead of following standard procedures to restrain the person, Morrison had used techniques learned from a Marine Corps psychiatrist to talk the passenger down. It was moments like these when his past experience proved invaluable in ways he'd never expected. The sound of raised voices from the cabin brought him back to the present. The bikers were getting bolder, their challenges to authority more direct. But Morrison saw something his fellow crew members might have missed: patterns in their behavior that reminded him of group dynamics he'd studied in the military. The way the others looked to bear for cues, the calculated nature of their disruptions, it all pointed to a hierarchy he could potentially use to his advantage. His military training had taught him to look for pressure points, not physical ones, but psychological ones. Every group, whether it was a military unit, a terrorist cell, or a biker gang, had its own internal logic, its own code. Understanding that code was often the key to controlling the situation. Lisa knocked on the cockpit door again, her face showing increasing concern as she reported the latest developments. Morrison listened carefully, but his mind was already formulating a plan. His years in Force Recon had taught him that the best operations were the ones where the target never knew they were being maneuvered until it was too late. As he reached for the intercom, Morrison felt the familiar calm that had served him well in countless critical situations. The skills he'd learned in the Marines weren't just about surviving, they were about leading, about taking control of chaos and turning it into order. Now, at cruise altitude over the American Southwest, those same skills were about to be put to a very different kind of test. The bikers thought they had the upper hand, thought they were dealing with just another airline pilot who would follow standard procedures. They had no idea they were up against someone who had spent years mastering the art of psychological warfare and strategic thinking. Morrison allowed himself a small smile as he prepared to turn the tables on his unwelcome passengers. They were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in a situation isn't the one making the most noise. Captain Morrison's mind worked like a chess player, already thinking several moves ahead as he assessed the situation in his aircraft. The noise from the cabin had reached a new level. The bikers were getting bolder, feeding off the fear they were creating. But Morrison knew that fear could work both ways if handled correctly. He thought back to his military training about psychological operations. The key wasn't to meet force with force, it was about changing the entire dynamic of the situation. He needed to shift the power balance without anyone realizing what was happening until it was too late. "Tom," he said to his co-pilot, "I need you to handle the radio calls for the next few minutes. I'm going to try something." His co-pilot nodded, understanding from Morrison's tone that he had a plan. First, Morrison needed more information. He called Lisa back to the cockpit for a detailed briefing. "Tell me everything you've noticed about their behavior patterns," he said, "even the small things." Lisa thought for a moment. "They're organized," she said. "They take turns causing problems, like they're following a plan. And they all watch Bear before doing anything. He's definitely their leader." Morrison nodded. This confirmed what he'd suspected. Their disruption wasn't random, it was coordinated. They were using classic intimidation tactics, spread out through the cabin, create multiple distractions, make the crew feel overwhelmed. But their reliance on their leader was also a weakness he could exploit. He pulled out the passenger manifest, studying it carefully. The bikers had booked their tickets separately but within minutes of each other. They'd chosen seats strategically, near exits spread throughout the cabin. This wasn't just a group of troublemakers, this was a planned operation. Morrison started writing notes, drawing from his experience in psychological warfare. The key was to understand your opponent's mindset. These men weren't just trying to cause trouble, they were trying to establish dominance, to show they were in control. But they were also likely carrying their own fears and insecurities, hidden beneath their tough exteriors. He thought about what he knew about motorcycle clubs. They operated on strict hierarchies, valued their reputation, and above all, hated looking weak in front of their peers. More importantly, they were always worried about law enforcement infiltration. That could be useful. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and through the cockpit door came the sound of Bear's voice, louder now, challenging another flight attendant. Morrison checked their position, still over an hour from Las Vegas, too far to simply wait it out. He began crafting his message carefully. In his military days, he'd learned that the right words, delivered with the right timing and tone, could be more effective than any physical action. He needed to strike the perfect balance, subtle enough to avoid escalation, but strong enough to change the dynamic completely. Morrison thought about his time working with hostage negotiators. They'd taught him that the key to control wasn't always about showing strength. Sometimes it was about creating doubt, uncertainty, and making the other party question their position. He pulled out his phone, making sure Lisa could see him doing it. He wasn't going to make any calls. At cruise altitude, it wouldn't work anyway. But he wanted her to see him checking something. It was all part of building the narrative he was about to create. "Lisa," he said, "I need you to do something specific. When I finish my announcement, I want you to walk through the cabin and look at each of the bikers directly, just for a moment, then make a note in your pad. Don't say anything to them. Can you do that?" She looked confused but nodded. Morrison knew this would add to the psychological impact of what he was about to do. Sometimes, the best way to handle a threat was to make them think they were the ones being threatened. He considered the timing carefully. The best psychological operations worked by creating a series of small doubts that built into larger uncertainty. He would need to layer his approach. First the announcement, then Lisa's walk through the cabin, and finally a follow-up that would cement the new power dynamic. Morrison checked their position again. They were flying over remote territory, which worked perfectly for what he had planned. Isolation could amplify anxiety, and he intended to use that to his advantage. He picked up the intercom, adjusting his seat so he was sitting perfectly straight. Posture affected voice, and he needed to sound exactly right, authoritative but casual, like someone who knew far more than he was saying. He'd learned in the military that tone could be as important as the words themselves. The plane hummed steadily as Morrison prepared to execute his plan. In the cabin, the bikers had no idea that their perceived control of the situation was about to be completely undermined. They thought they were dealing with a simple commercial pilot who would follow standard procedures. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Morrison took a deep breath, thinking through his words one final time. Everything had to be perfectly calibrated: the timing, the tone, the implications. He wasn't just going to give an announcement. He was about to conduct a masterclass in psychological manipulation, using nothing but words and carefully crafted uncertainty to regain control of his aircraft. Morrison's finger hovered over the intercom button for just a moment. In the cabin, the tension had reached a breaking point. Bear's voice carried through the cockpit door, making another veiled threat to a flight attendant. The time had come to change everything. The intercom crackled to life. Morrison's voice came through clear and steady, with a hint of warmth that made everyone, passengers and troublemakers alike, pay attention. It wasn't the usual pilot announcement tone. This was different. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." He paused, letting the standard opening sink in. The cabin quieted, as it always did when the captain's voice came over the speakers. But what came next was anything but standard. "I hope you're all enjoying our flight to Las Vegas." His voice carried a casual confidence that made even Bear stop mid-sentence. "You know, it's funny how small the world can be sometimes. Just this morning, I was on the phone with an old buddy of mine." Morrison let that hang in the air for a moment. In the cabin, Lisa noticed the bikers exchanging glances. They could tell something was different about this announcement, but couldn't quite figure out what. "He's actually leading the FBI's motorcycle gang task force in Vegas now," Morrison continued, his tone still conversational, as if he was sharing an interesting coincidence rather than delivering a warning. "We were catching up, talking about the old days in Force Recon, and he mentioned he'd love to meet some of our passengers today, especially our friends from Steel Thunder." The effect was immediate. Through the cockpit door's security camera, Morrison could see Bear's face change. The biker's confident smirk faltered, replaced by something closer to concern. His friends weren't looking much better. "It's amazing, really," Morrison went on, his voice taking on an almost reminiscent quality. "You'd be surprised how many former military folks end up in interesting places. Some become airline pilots, some join the FBI." He let that idea settle. "And some, well, they find other paths." In the cabin, Lisa was doing exactly as Morrison had instructed. She walked slowly down the aisle, making deliberate eye contact with each biker, then writing something in her notepad. The psychological impact was perfect. Each man watched her pass, their earlier bravado replaced by obvious unease. "Now, I should mention," Morrison continued, "my friend was particularly interested in some recent activities in Colorado. Something about some missing shipments. He wasn't very specific, you know how these federal types can be, but he seemed pretty excited about greeting this flight." The bikers were now sitting perfectly still, their earlier swagger completely evaporated. Bear, who had been standing in the aisle, quickly found his seat. His followers looked to him for guidance, but for once, their leader seemed to have nothing to say. "Of course, it could all be a coincidence," Morrison added, his tone still light but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Vegas is a big city after all. But if any of our passengers do happen to run into my old friend, please tell him Captain Morrison says hello." The intercom clicked off. The silence that followed was profound. Other passengers, who had been watching the scene unfold with nervous attention, now looked at the bikers with new understanding. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Lisa continued her walk through the cabin, pausing occasionally to write in her notepad. She didn't need to write anything specific. The act itself was enough to reinforce the message. Each time she made a note, The bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of the younger bikers whispered something to Bear, his face pale. Bear shook his head sharply, clearly trying to figure out if Morrison's announcement was a bluff or a genuine threat. The uncertainty was worse than any direct confrontation would have been. In the cockpit, Morrison watched through the security feed as his words took full effect. He'd carefully crafted every element of his message, the casual tone, the specific details, the deliberate vagueness about certain points. It was psychological warfare at its finest. The genius of his approach was in what he hadn't said. He'd made no direct threats, issued no warnings, and broken no protocols. Instead, he created a web of uncertainty that was far more effective than any show of force could have been. Other passengers began to relax as they noticed the change in the biker's behavior. A few even smiled, understanding that their captain had just handled a potentially dangerous situation with nothing more than words and wit. Tom, the co-pilot, glanced at Morrison with newfound respect. "That was impressive," he said quietly. "You really think your friend will be waiting in Vegas?" Morrison allowed himself a small smile. "Let's just say the Steel Thunder guys will be too worried about the possibility to cause any more trouble." He checked their position, still about an hour out from Las Vegas, but he knew the rest of the flight would be very different from the first part. Through the cabin, a new atmosphere settled in. The bikers sat quietly, all thoughts of causing trouble forgotten as they worried about what might be waiting for them at the gate. Each time the flight attendants passed, the men straightened in their seats, suddenly model passengers. Morrison's announcement had done more than just stop the immediate problem. It had completely reversed the power dynamic on the flight. The predators had become the prey, and they knew it, all without a single direct confrontation or threat. The transformation in the cabin was like watching a thunderstorm clear into a calm day. The bikers, who had been strutting around like they owned the plane just minutes earlier, now sat quietly in their seats, casting nervous glances at each other and the flight attendants. Bear, their leader, seemed to have shrunk in his seat. His massive frame, which had earlier been used to intimidate others, was now turned inward, trying to attract as little attention as possible. He kept checking his phone, even though at cruising altitude it was useless. His weathered face showed the calculations happening behind his eyes, trying to figure out if Morrison's announcement was a bluff or a real threat. One of the younger bikers leaned forward to whisper something to Bear, but was silenced with a sharp look. The group's easy confidence had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that was almost visible in the air. Every time a flight attendant passed by with their notepad, the men stiffened, wondering what was being written about them. Lisa, walking through the cabin with a new confidence, noticed how the other passengers' attitudes had changed too. The businessman who had earlier closed his laptop in frustration now worked freely, occasionally glancing at the subdued bikers with a slight smile. The young mother who had asked to be moved had relaxed, no longer clutching her child quite so tightly. An elderly couple who had witnessed the whole transformation whispered to each other, the wife patting her husband's hand with obvious relief. Other passengers who had been tense and quiet now spoke in normal voices, the atmosphere of fear completely dissolved. In the cockpit, Morrison kept an eye on the security feed while handling routine flight duties. He watched as one of the bikers made his way to the bathroom, now careful to follow proper protocol, waiting for the seatbelt sign to be off and moving quickly and quietly through the cabin. The man's earlier swagger was gone, replaced by an almost comical attempt to appear non-threatening. Tom, the co-pilot, shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like it," he said quietly. "One announcement, and it's like they're different people." Morrison nodded, understanding the psychology at play. "Fear of the unknown is a powerful thing," he replied. "Right now, they're running through every possible scenario in their heads, probably thinking about things they've done that could interest the FBI. The uncertainty is worse than any direct threat." Through the cabin, the effect rippled outward. The flight attendants moved about their duties with renewed confidence, no longer dreading each interaction with the bikers. When they asked the men to put their seats up or stir their tray tables, the response was immediate and respectful, sometimes even accompanied by a quiet thank you. Bear seemed to be taking it the hardest. As the leader, he had the most to lose if Morrison's FBI contact was real. Every few minutes he would shift in his seat, glance toward the cockpit, then check his phone again. The uncertainty was clearly eating at him. One of the other bikers attempted to order another drink, but Bear shut that down immediately with a harsh whisper. They all knew that the best strategy now was to be as invisible as possible. The same men who had been loudly broadcasting their presence earlier now tried their best to disappear into their seats. Lisa returned to the cockpit to give Morrison an update, her face showing both relief and amusement. They apologized, she said, almost in disbelief. The big one, Bear, actually said he was sorry for giving us trouble, said something about having a bad day and taking it out on the wrong people. Morrison smiled slightly. It was a classic response. When faced with a potential threat, people often try to minimize their previous actions, rewrite the narrative to make themselves appear less threatening. The bikers were already trying to create a story that would explain away their behavior if they really were met by FBI agents in Vegas. The other passengers had picked up on the story too. A few were on their phones as soon as the Wi-Fi was available, probably looking up news about Steel Thunder or FBI operations in Colorado. The bikers noticed this extra attention and sank even lower in their seats. One of the flight attendants had to suppress a laugh when Bear, who had earlier demanded drinks with aggressive entitlement, now politely asked for a water with a please and thank you. His rough voice was almost comically gentle, like a bear trying to meow like a kitten. In the galley, the crew shared knowing looks. They had all dealt with difficult passengers before, but never had they seen such a complete reversal. One of them whispered to Lisa, "I wish Captain Morrison could handle all our problem passengers like this." As the flight continued, the bikers remained model passengers, following every instruction to the letter. When there was slight turbulence, they immediately fastened their seatbelts without being asked. When the drink service came around, they were almost painfully polite. The transformation was so complete that some of the other passengers who had boarded mid-flight would never have guessed that these quiet, compliant men were the same ones who had been terrorizing the cabin less than an hour ago. It was a testament to the power of psychological warfare, how the right words, delivered with the right authority, could completely change the dynamic of a situation. Morrison's military training had taught him that the most effective victories often came without firing a shot. Today, at 30,000 feet, he had proven that principle once again. With nothing more than carefully chosen words and strategic uncertainty, he had turned a potentially dangerous situation into a masterclass in control. The Las Vegas skyline appeared on the horizon, its buildings shimmering in the desert heat. As Captain Morrison began the descent, the atmosphere in the cabin was completely different from what it had been just hours before. The bikers, who had caused so much trouble earlier, now sat perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the approaching city. The landing gear lowered with a familiar thud, and Morrison noticed Bear flinch at the sound. The once intimidating biker leader was now visibly sweating, probably imagining FBI agents waiting at the gate. His fellow gang members looked equally uncomfortable, their earlier bravado replaced by nervous glances at their phones and watches. As the plane touched down smoothly on the Las Vegas runway, a quiet murmur of appreciation ran through the cabin. Several passengers looked toward the cockpit with knowing smiles, understanding that they had witnessed something remarkable, a potential crisis diffused without a single raised voice or direct confrontation. Lisa prepared the cabin for arrival, moving with the confidence of someone who knew they had nothing to fear. When she asked the bikers to return their seats to the upright position, they complied instantly, almost eagerly. One of them even helped an elderly woman get her bag from the overhead compartment, the same man who had been making crude comments just hours earlier. The plane taxied to the gate, and Morrison made his final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Las Vegas. Local time is 2:45 p.m., and the temperature is 92 degrees. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off." He paused for a moment, then added, "And to our special guests today, thanks for making the second half of our flight so pleasant. I'm sure some people are looking forward to meeting you." That last comment sent a visible shiver through the biker group. Bear wiped his forehead with a bandana, his tough guy image completely forgotten. The other bikers had gone pale, probably wondering if they'd see handcuffs instead of slot machines in Vegas. As passengers began to deplane, Morrison stepped out of the cockpit to oversee the process, standing tall in his captain's uniform. The other passengers filed past him, many offering quiet thanks or knowing nods. A businessman in a short suit paused to shake his hand, whispering, "That was brilliant, Captain. Absolutely brilliant." The bikers were the last to leave their seats, a strategic decision that didn't go unnoticed. They gathered their belongings slowly, clearly dreading what might await them at the gate. As they approached the cockpit door, Bear stopped, looking at Morrison with a mix of respect and uncertainty. For a moment, the two men locked eyes. Bear's massive frame seemed to deflate as he met Morrison's steady gaze. "Good flight, Captain," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect. The words weren't just a casual comment, they were an acknowledgement of defeat, a recognition that he had met his match in a way he hadn't expected. Morrison nodded in response, his expression professional but carrying just a hint of knowing authority. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was enough to remind them of the uncertainty that awaited. The bikers filed past him, their leather vests no longer symbols of intimidation but markers that might identify them to waiting law enforcement. After the last passenger had deplaned, the crew gathered in the galley, the excitement of the unusual flight still evident in their faces. Lisa shook her head in amazement. "In 15 years of flying, I've never seen anything like that," she said. "You didn't just stop them, Captain, you completely turned them around." Tom, the co-pilot, was equally impressed. "The way you used their own tactics against them, making them feel watched and uncertain, that was something else. And you did it all without breaking a single regulation or protocol." Morrison smiled slightly as he gathered his flight documents. "Sometimes the best way to handle a threat isn't to meet it head-on," he explained. "It's about changing the game entirely. Make them question their position, and they'll often defeat themselves." The story spread quickly through the airline's crew network. By the end of the day, flight attendants and pilots at major airports were talking about the captain who had tamed a biker gang with nothing but words and wit. Some of the details grew in the telling. By the time the story reached New York, some versions had a SWAT team waiting at the gate. But the real lesson wasn't about confrontation or force. It was about understanding human nature, about knowing when to use authority and when to use psychology. Morrison had shown that true power often lies not in physical strength or loud threats, but in the ability to take control of a situation through intelligence and strategic thinking. As Morrison headed to his hotel that evening, he thought about how his military experience had served him in an unexpected way. The skills he'd learned in Force Recon weren't just about combat, they were about understanding people, reading situations, and knowing how to maintain control without escalating conflict. The incident became a teaching moment in airline crew training sessions. Instructors used it as an example of how creative thinking and psychological insight could be more effective than traditional protocols in handling difficult situations. They emphasized that Morrison hadn't just solved an immediate problem, he had done it in a way that maintained dignity and professionalism throughout. Months later, Morrison would occasionally hear stories about a group of bikers who became surprisingly cooperative whenever they flew. Whether it was his flight that changed them or they just learned to behave better on planes, he never knew for sure. But one thing was certain. Somewhere in Vegas that day, 5 members of the Steel Thunder Motorcycle Club had learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one making threats, but the one who knows how to take control without making a sound.